It's not just Antifa lunatics, unfortunately, who have completely lost their minds, lost their ability to reason in the era of Trump. It is all the way up to the top reaches of the government, as we've seen with Sancticomey, James Comey. The guy's just a weirdo and the most sanctimonious and slimy and dishonest person to work the FBI in a very long time, maybe ever. But you've seen this in very powerful positions, people that have a lot of sway, that have a lot of reach, who are they're completely unreasonable what they're doing. They don't care about the damage to institutions, to the broader society. They want to get Trump people or Trump himself, and everything else is secondary to that. I bring this up because of the news today out of the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. The initial two out of three of the initial federal judges who looked at this in D.C., to their credit as actual jurists, as people that believe in the law and not making sure that they are treated well by left-wing, law firms and the D.C.-based media, people that don't care about what's said about them at cocktail parties in Georgetown, which are real. I know people say, "Oh, what about the Georgetown cocktail party?" That's a real thing that happens for the fancy people in D.C. They knew that it's a very straightforward situation with General Flynn at this point. The government, the prosecutorial arm of the government, dropped its case. Okay? Dropped the case against Flynn. Said this should not have been brought. This was wrong. Judge Sullivan, who is the federal judge on this case, said, well, hold on a second. What do you mean you're dropping the case? Clearly he hates Flynn. He's already shown himself to be a Flynn hater when he accused him in court of being a traitor, which no one on the prosecution side had ever said. I mean, that's like he was watching a Rachel Maddow monologue and was like, oh, I'm going to bring that into my courtroom. Absurd. He's guilty of lying to the FBI over nothing. And he's not even guilty of it, but I'm saying that was the initial guilty plea. Lying to the FBI. It had nothing to do with being a traitor. His phone call to Kislyak was completely fine. Didn't break any laws. Well within the scope of his duties. Nothing wrong with it. Zero. Libs don't care. So you had 2 out of 3 judges that said that he needs a writ of that Flynn should get a writ of mandamus. A writ of mandamus is an emergency order to vacate a court proceeding. So it's effectively like, this is done. Like, we're out. Shut it down. Shut it down. No, Judge Sullivan doesn't want to shut it down. He wants to keep on forcing Flynn to show up to court, to pay legal fees, to face possible federal prosecution. And 2 out of 3 judges said you can't have a criminal proceeding without a prosecution. You can't appoint as a judge some left-wing buddy of yours, some lib, which is what he did. This former judge Gleason appointed him to argue the side of the prosecution when the prosecution, which is an executive branch responsibility. This is a separation of powers issue. The executive branch came in and said, well, we don't want to do that. This is not a good prosecution. We're dropping it. A judge, which is the judicial branch, as we know, has appointed a buddy to be like, you're now the shadow prosecutor. We're going to pretend that you're prosecuting this case on behalf of the government. He has no authority to do that. This is eradicating separation of powers. This is crazy. If this stands, then a judge could always just say, I'm going to appoint somebody and they're going to declare that, that you're being prosecuted. Show up to my court. What? It's a complete outrage. This is not a close call situation, my friends. And the Democrats will say, but he pleaded guilty. Democrats argue for people to be exonerated, for the government to have to overturn the sentence decades after cases where they were on tape, giving a confession with relatives present, and overwhelming evidence of guilt. They'll say, oh, that never should have happened. But here, because he was forced into a guilty plea by the government lying about the evidence that it had, which it's not supposed to do. It's a Brady violation. Because of all of that, what? Where does this leave us? Oh, let's just continue to see if Judge Sullivan should be able to call into question the federal government's motives for dropping the case. That's what this is going to be. Now, this is going to turn into an anti-Trump # resistance carnival. That's what they're going to do. That's what Judge Sullivan wants to do. He's got his buddy in there, and they're going to make this whole thing about how, the Mueller probe and Russia collusion and Flynn and how he was the center of this. These people they're completely nuts. They lose, and they don't accept that they've lost. They were wrong, and they don't accept that they were wrong. They push forward with it anyway. And that's exactly what they're doing here. So what ends up happening? And now it just continues on. I always tell you the process is the punishment, and that is exactly how the libs have approached this case against Flynn for months. Just drag it out. Ultimately, what they're going to do, I think, the real nuclear option from Judge Sullivan's perspective, would be to sentence Flynn. He could still try to sentence Flynn. He could do it to prison. Judges have once you're in their courtroom, their authority is really unchecked. And if you have an appeals court full of Obama appointee libs, which is what the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals has, you can get no justice whatsoever. Flynn is a target of the left, and they will, like a terrier with a bone, they will not let it go. They will not let it go. This man is innocent, did nothing wrong. Guy served his country for over 30 years in the military. They don't care. Ruin his life, bankrupt him, destroy his reputation. They don't care. And so what will they do? They'll see if this Judge Gleason, former Judge Gleason, who has been appointed by Judge Sullivan to stand in for the prosecution, that the federal government, it's not like the federal government says, yeah, we don't have the resources, or they said this was a bad prosecution, drop it. We no longer want this case to proceed. What could be more clear than that? Can you imagine you're a judge? Imagine you're a judge and you have a defendant in front of you, and you have the prosecution, the federal government, the Department of Justice from the highest level comes forward and says, we drop the case. You're going to still prosecute this person? That's what's going on. You think that there's justice in America? Unfortunately, in the era of Trump, no, there is not. Because of the deep state Democrats, there is not justice. This is a grave injustice. There's no good faith argument. You just had 8-2 federal appeals court justices in D.C. by 8-2. The only two that realized the writ of mandamus should be granted here were the ones that were on the 2 out of 3 panel. When they went en banc, which means the entire appeals court, all the judges in the appeals court in D.C. have to hear it and then rule on it, 8-2. Crush this motion. So, and this only happened because Judge Sullivan, instead of accepting the initial appeals court decision, pushed it to the max. And I want an en banc hearing. I want to hear from everybody on this one. And this guy has gone completely off the rails. Completely off the rails. But it's punishing General Flynn. And Democrats won't stand up for him. They don't care about the injustices going on here. They don't care this is an innocent man that they've ruined. If anything, they're upset. This is really, for them, the only high-level scalp that mattered to them was General Flynn. Yeah, Paul Manafort, but Paul Manafort was he got fired from the campaign. He was clearly kind of a sleazy political operator. No one, that's different than the former DIA chief, who's a 30-plus year military veteran and combatant. Getting and the incoming national security advisor, that's a much bigger deal for them. And this is really all they had to show for all the Mueller prosecution. The only real political points they scored were entrapping Flynn with this FBI thing, which was all James Comey's move. That's who James Comey is, a disgusting piece of you-know-what who will entrap you with federal lying to the FBI charges when you are the national security advisor of the United States, entrap you on a nothing burger. And it's not even clear that he lied. That's the other part of this. It's not even like they got him to lie. They didn't think he lied. The FBI didn't think he lied, but then later on they said, well, the Mueller probe came along and said, we got to get this guy. Let's tag him. They got him. Where is this all heading? I've called this all along. I hate to be the one that says, I was right about this, but I am right about this. I told you after the initial appeals court ruling came down, the 2 out of 3 saying the writ of mandamus should be granted, that this would go en banc, and then it was, probably not going to go Flynn's way. He's got a bunch of Obama appointees on this circuit court circuit court of appeals rather, and they want to make a point of punishing Flynn to the maximum. No one wants to step forward and say the Flynn prosecution was unjust because they'll be hated by libs forever, and they know that. No one wants to come forward and say it. I mean, who's a lib? So what happens now? The Supreme Court hopefully will be asked to grant an emergency stay And the Supreme Court will have to come in to the picture here. And you know what that means? You'll probably get a 5-4 decision. I think you'll get a 5-4 decision. I think the stay is likely to be granted, and then you'll get a 5-4 decision eventually from the Supreme Court that this is wrong, and they'll say that it was all partisan and political. If I'm wrong, and maybe they go to the sentencing phase, or they try to maintain the guilty verdict against Flynn and say that he's sentenced to time served, but he's now a convicted felon, you know what that's going to trigger? Trump will pardon him. And then they'll say that was political. They're trying to force this into a position where they can claim that it's the Trump side of things that has abused the law and been political, and they won't let it go until they at least get that. They've already ruined Flynn, so they've accomplished that in their minds. Good job. These people are barbarians, okay? They don't care what they do to human beings. They don't care about the laws they violate and what they're willing to abuse to get their way. They've already gotten that against Flynn. But now they want to make sure that the narrative for their side becomes, well, we did everything we could to ruin this guy, but it was only because of Trump with his pardon, another corrupt pardon for a Trump crony like Roger Stone, who was commuted, not pardoned. It's only because of that this guy didn't end up with a felony record. They just want to make sure that he's a convicted felon. They want to keep that. Trump's incoming national security advisor, convicted felon. And then in years past, they're already doing it. They're making movies. They're totally rewriting history. Totally rewriting history. Delusional. Utterly delusional. But this is what we're up against. We live in a country now, unfortunately, increasingly defined by dishonesty and lies. And it's very hard to win when you have so many millions of people, tens of millions of people, who will just believe it all. And it becomes an article of religious faith. You know, what the New York Times says in its editorial pages must be true. And if you deny that, if you argue with that, you undermine the sense that some of these libs have that they're really sophisticated and wise and brilliant and everything else. That's the stakes for them. They're never going to accept that they were fooled and swindled by all this. It makes them feel good to hate Trump. It makes them feel like they're really accomplishing something by posting the most vicious anti-Trump nonsense possible on their social media platforms, by thinking that Russia stole the election. Which, really, think about that. What an incredible feat that would have been if Russia was able to manage that. It's not an easy thing to do. By putting a little propaganda online, it's really, my friends, we live in an era of mass delusions on the left. And it's increasingly difficult to maintain your own moorings on reality because they have all spun off into another planet. I don't even know where they are anymore.
Hey, Team Buck, thank you so much for watching The First on YouTube. If you like this video, please click that little thumbs up button so then it will log as liked. And also, if you want to see more great content from The First, please click subscribe.